Canadians have always prided themselves on our national commitment to human rights around the world. What better way to commemorate that commitment than by putting it in a museum? At least, that was the idea. It was dreamed up in 2003 by the late Winnipeg media mogul Izzy Asper. Prime Minister Stephen Harper announced his plan to make it a national museum 4 years after that. At the time, the price tag for the museum was $265 million. 5 years later, it hit over $350 million, with its backers demanding more and more support from you, the taxpayer. Do you object? Then you must hate the idea of this museum. You must hate progress. They criticize the Eiffel Tower, but now it's the Eiffel Tower. Please spare us. For more on the numbers, let's turn to Colin Craig, Prairie Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation and future curator of the Canadian Museum for Taxpayer Rights. Isn't that right, Colin? Now, look, my tongue is in my cheek. I don't believe that if somebody hates the idea of being hosed financially, that means that they hate culture. So I just want people to know, because sometimes people hear something and they take it literally. But how did this get as expensive as it is?
Well, I think the problem is boiled down to something quite simple. They went ahead with the museum without knowing exactly how it was going to be paid for or what the final price tag was. Now, no one would do that in with their own money. If they were going to go out and buy a house, you'd never go out and agree to buy it if you didn't know what the price was or how you're going to pay for it.
All right, let me just go back to Izzy Asper himself.
Yeah.
I mean, here's a guy who started many businesses, was extremely successful. Never started a business without a business plan.
Right.
Now, he wasn't the one on the ground doing any of this. It was his dream. Yeah. He was, if you will, the visionary, and other people were involved with specific strategy and tactics. Why would the government have given the green light with money, big money, without a business plan?
Well, that's the problem. They shouldn't have. And, I mean, let's be clear. I think Izzy Asper's original idea was a noble one. I mean, no one's going to question whether or not building human rights is a noble objective or not. I mean, that's fair.
Yeah, this isn't about human rights. Yeah, this is about taxpayer rights.
Exactly. It's about accountability.
Yeah.
And, yeah, I mean, it's not responsible to go out and build something if you don't know what the final price tag is or how you're going to pay for that. And this has been our point all along, is that if someone wants to go out and build a museum like this, all the power to them, but they shouldn't expect everyone else to be forced to pay for it through their tax dollars.
Okay, so now, just to be absolutely clear about this, a significant chunk of the money has been raised privately, is that right?
Yes. Yeah, and the group that's done that fundraising deserves credit, because most federal museums don't have that fundraising component. So they've raised over $100 million, and that's good for them. But really, in terms of the government segment now, we're looking at around $170 million to build it, and about $22 million a year once the thing opens, because it's not going to be able to stay afloat. It needs to be subsidized.
Can you, I'm not suggesting that you're an expert on museum, and I'm not an expert either, but to anyone watching this, they're going, why would it cost $22 million to operate the museum? And I guess the other question would be, what kind of return did they expect? I mean, do you have any idea? I mean, were they expecting at some point to actually bring in $22 million a year to cover that?
You know, I don't think they ever expected this thing to break even. I think the original plan was that it would always be subsidized by taxpayers. And, you know, for an organization like ours, we say, no, that's not right. I mean, if you want to go out and build a museum or a stadium or who knows what, go for it, but don't expect everyone else to pay for it. Leave the money in people's pockets. And if they want to donate to the museum, by all means, go for it. But don't force people to do it.
Okay. Earlier tonight on something completely different, I said we Canadians tend to be pragmatic. That's if one wants to call it an ideology, call it a philosophy. We're pragmatic people. What's the pragmatic approach here? What could be done at this point? I mean, is the horse out of the barn, toothpaste out of the tube, taxpayers on the hook for as far as the eye can see, or can something be done at this point? Because after all, the building hasn't even been completed yet.
Yeah, and I guess that's the thing, is that the museum is, say, half built, three-quarters built, whatever it is. I mean, it's underway. So the big question is, how do you deal with it? And what we've recommended is first of all, no more tax dollars towards construction of it. Any remaining money that's still sitting there waiting to be spent, use it to seal up the structure so that it's not going to get damaged on the inside from the elements. And then those that want the museum can go out and put their own homes up as collateral, or their own businesses, whatever assets they have, they can put it up as collateral to get a loan to finish the museum and leave it completely up to those that want the museum from this point forward. They're the ones that can pay for it.
Are there people who say, you know what, something has gone awry here? Why don't we put something else in there? I mean, are there people who are saying that right now?
In terms of content in the museum?
Yeah, just instead of it being a museum, being something else.
Oh, I see, like a business.
A convention center or something.
You know, I'm not sure. I mean, I guess at this point we're saying, look, taxpayers have already put in enough money. Leave it up to proponents to figure out how they're going to make this thing work. You know, that you might consider doing that, putting in some businesses or who knows what.
Colin, thank you.
Thank you, Charles.
Thanks very much. Colin Craig of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Now, the Human Rights Museum is not about taxpayers' toil exclusively. The priorities of the exhibits are causing a lot of heat as well. And I mean heat. We'll tell you what that's about. Just a few moments ago, we told you about the bewildering math behind the Canadian Museum for Human Rights. That's not the only controversy that's being caused. Plans for the museum include a number of permanent galleries, one devoted to the Holocaust. Nearly anyone will agree that it's the pinnacle of inhumanity. Anyone who doesn't probably isn't worth bothering to have a conversation with. But other atrocities like the Holodomor, a Ukrainian famine widely thought to have been premeditated by Joseph Stalin, aren't getting exhibits of their own. The result has been a fierce debate in Winnipeg media concerning bias on the museum's part. And it brings up an interesting question. Does the Holocaust get so much more attention than other atrocities? Does it deserve more attention than other atrocities? Here to explore is our in-house historian John Robertson and John Robson in Ottawa. Hey, John, thank you so much for coming in.
Hello.
All right. Professor Robson, put your hat on for an issue that a lot of people are reluctant to talk about. This idea of measuring one Holocaust to another. It makes people massively uncomfortable. And there are many, many people who aren't anti-Semitic necessarily. Many of them may be Jews themselves, who sometimes will ask themselves the question, how come other genocides don't get as much publicity as the Holocaust? So where does the professor come down?
I come down on the side of thinking that the Holocaust represents the pinnacle of organized evil in human affairs. But others, and the Holodomor to me would be one, certainly ought in a human rights museum to have a permanent exhibit because it was a very major, as we said, widely thought to have been engineered by Joseph Stalin. It was engineered by Stalin for very clear and hideous reasons. And I mean, again, we'll never know the total number of victims because the authorities were not keeping track. As long as they died and went away, that was good enough for them. But it was clearly well into the millions. And it was carried out deliberately, officiously, over a long period of time, and it reduced perpetrators to moral idiots at the same time that it killed its victims. You know, I remember Malcolm Muggeridge. It was after seeing that, he wrote in his journal words that I have quoted repeatedly. He said, whatever else I may say or do, I must never pretend I have not seen this. So there are others. I mean, all kinds of examples of the appalling ability of humans to get together to do dreadful things to their fellows. Why then do I say Holocaust comes at the top? And I'd say there are two reasons. One is because it happened in what was the heart of the civilized world. People said that with the astonishment that this could happen in the land of Goethe and of Beethoven, that proved that when humans achieve a peak of culture, it doesn't seem to do anything to diminish their capacity for evil. It merely puts greater technical resources in their hands. And also, when I was in Israel, I was given a very interesting book on anti-Semitism. It's called Why the Jews? And it was written by two Jewish authors. And they said, when people talk about anti-Semitism, they'll talk about economic things or xenophobia, talk about anything but Judaism. And what they said is, it's because the Jews brought the message of ethical monotheism to the world, that there is one God, omnipotent, God of all of us, who is a God of justice but also of mercy, and he wants us to stop being such jerks toward one another. And people, ever since this message was first brought to their attention, have reacted by killing the messenger. And so, any regime that's sufficiently evil will become anti-Semitic. Imperial Japan did it. They didn't even have any Jews. Where are they going to get Jews? They passed anti-Semitic laws. And anybody who's anti-Semitic will eventually become extremely evil. And that is not just coincidence, and we can't afford to ignore it. But it doesn't mean we're ranking and saying, oh, Ukrainians count less. It's just when we're trying to isolate the roots of human evil. The Holocaust, I think, for those two reasons, has a special place because of why the victims were targeted and because of where it happened.
Now, why is it that you mentioned the Ukrainian famine? We could talk about many others. Let's focus on that because that seems to be where the friction is. Why hasn't there been more written about what Stalin did to the Ukrainians? I mean, it's just there is some, but not very much. So why do you suppose that is, Professor?
I think it is because of this lingering sympathy with communism as a phenomenon of the left. I remember this when a longtime head of the American Communist Party died, and mainstream press obituaries talked about how he never gave up the faith. If the head of the American Nazi Party had died in an advanced age, could one imagine such a thing being written? I do not understand this. The idea that Stalin was less evil than Hitler, to me, is preposterous. I mean, they both achieved the ultimate pinnacle of villainy, at which point comparisons become very, very hard to make. But there is this instinctive socialism, communism, their hearts are in the right place. And again, when you look at the facts of Stalin's rule, in every area from foreign policy to the deliberate extermination of millions of his own citizens, this is untenable. But I think that's why it is. There's this lingering, ghastly, sentimental affection for it. It was just to think about, I was reading about the Spanish Civil War and talking about this coalition that fought the Franco, who was allied with Hitler, and it never mentioned that the Republican side was allied with Stalin. Like, that's preposterous whitewashing of what was idealism exploited for evil purposes.
Well, Professor, Mao killed tens of millions. Some say 30 million. Some say 50 million. Some say 80 million. There's not been enough scholarship done on it. But, I mean, tens of millions. I mean, at what point do you have to be a mass murderer for people to take it seriously? But how often do you hear Mao being put in the same jar as Hitler and Stalin?
Well, as Hitler, it never happens. I mean, again, people talk about Trudeau, this youthful trip to Red China, defying convention. Oh, wasn't he bold? Imagine if he'd made a youthful trip to Nazi Germany and come back impressed. You know, it would be a permanent stain on his reputation. And I'll bring up by contrast, Tommy Douglas, who in his youth did flirt with eugenics and was a pacifist. And he went to Nazi Germany and he came back appalled. Never did he return to his eugenic beliefs, and he helped lead his party's break with its founder over the issue of war with Hitler. And we say, great, he went to Nazi Germany, he saw what was there, he changed his thinking. And this is a permanent plus in his place in history. But when people talk about Maoism in Red China, it's like as though it's preposterous to be anti-communist. I mean, what? The Chinese don't count because there's so many of them? I mean, again, we'll never even know how many people he killed. No one will ever be able to count the victims. No one counted the bodies. Now, even with the Holocaust, the Nazis intentionally tried to exterminate even the memory of the victims. You know, the Yad Vashem, the memory project, trying to get the names, they're never going to get half of them. But they do have a fairly good idea of the total. You know, 6 million is not a hard figure, but it's close. With the Holodomor or even the Chinese, we'll never even know, but that doesn't make their deaths less important.
Thank you so much, Professor Robson. An interesting and important conversation that many people, and certainly on many media platforms, don't have as courageously as you've offered it to us. Thank you so much, sir.
Thanks for having me on the show.